Joining me now is media lawyer John Paul Cashen from Thomson Geer Lawyers. Good evening to you, JP.
Good evening.
Now, you were instrumental in fighting this suppression order in court. Were you surprised with the government's response today?
I was very surprised. I mean, what we have is a government who was lying to the people and doing it very knowingly, to the point where when that lie was exposed and should have been told to the people through part of a court process, they continued to lie and then sought a suppression order over it, trying to cover up the lie. And if they had their way, it'd be covered up for the next 5 years.
Well, it's incredible, really. I mean, you've got a government here that, as you say, is lying to the people. When you go out and say something as rock solid, and it's still on the government's website, that contact tracing data will only be used for contact tracing purposes, and then they're admitting in court that that is not the case. But we want to hide that from people because, of course, they'll lose confidence in the system. How hard can it possibly be to create a system that is watertight and would not allow this contact tracing QR code data to be gained by the police or a company or WorkSafe or any other entity?
Well, that's right. I mean, it's not that hard to create a system. They're the government. They pass whatever laws Parliament will let them pass, which seems to be pretty much whatever they want. But of course, there's another question as well here, which is, why didn't they just tell people the truth? It's a very easy fix. If you have a look at the terms and conditions of data collection privacy policy of any other organisation, it says, we will keep your information private, except unless we are required to compel it by a process of law. And that might be, as you've pointed out, a warrant from the police or a subpoena in civil proceedings or from a regulator. WorkSafe is not the only regulator that has the power to seek documents. IBAC can get documents, the EPA can get documents, mining inspectors can get documents. There's lots of ways that third parties can get their hands on your documents. What they really should have been doing is saying to people, we will keep your information as confidential as we can, but it's not absolute. And that's the real problem. They didn't tell people the truth. It was really a very easy fix. And even now, as you say, it seems to be an absolute statement on the website. And yet again, even with the new pandemic laws, there are still some carve-outs. It's still possible for information to be released in certain, albeit limited circumstances. But, why can't people be told that?
Well, and of course, this is what happened in WA, where that information was released. The police applied for it, and in a number of cases, it was given to them. They had a number of failed applications as well, which is finally how they got on top of it and passed legislation in WA that prevented police from being able to get hold of QR code data. But the government has had this claim in Victoria for public interest immunity. What is public interest immunity?
Well, it's sort of the last weapon that government can use to keep its information secret. So usually the government has to behave like anyone else in the courts. So if it's a criminal matter or a civil matter or the regulator wants documents, the government has to hand them over, just as you or I would have to hand them over if we're compelled to. But the government can go to a court and say, you know what, in this particular circumstance, the public interest is better served by the government being able to keep its secrets, and that we should be exempted from the usual court processes in this particular case. It's the kind of thing you'll see used in the Ben Roberts-Smith case. Certain information's been withheld because it related to military secrets. In the Lawyer X case, the police were saying that protecting the identity of a confidential informant is important for the process. And in this case, obviously the government's argument would be, well, the contact tracing process will be hampered if people think their information will be released. And so the court should step in and help us keep it secret, that it's a public interest, in the public interest for that information to be kept secret. And I mean, that's an argument they might win or they might lose, but they very much could lose it. Certainly the WorkSafe, Victorian WorkCover Authority, wanted the documents. They didn't seem to think public interest immunity was a proper ground for resisting them. And as it turns out, that's unresolved. We never got a final resolution to that in this case. But there is a possibility that this information could be released and that public interest immunity claim might have failed.
But the problem is that the information should never be released. And if you are writing legislation that allows you to collect more data than a government has ever collected on an individual in their lives, there should surely be safeguards in there that mean that another government entity or the police or a company cannot get hold of this stuff. The people of Victoria have been hoodwinked.
Yeah, I agree. And look, the new legislation certainly does take steps to address that. The ways in which it can be released now are more limited than they were. Although there is still an ability for the information to be released if the government consider there's an imminent threat to health or safety or welfare. So it's possible that information can still be released under that clause. Now, there's no requirement to go and get a court order to release it under that. A bunch of public servants can sit around and say, in this particular case, we think that there's a threat to health and safety and we're going to use the data for whatever reason. So there's still some limited exceptions there. But I mean, I agree with you. It should be, I think we all have a vested interest in the contact tracing system working. And really you'd think after 18 months, this is something that could have been fixed a lot earlier.
And I mean, what are the wider implications here around privacy and data security issues? Because if we now have an example on the books where, someone has tried to get hold of this data and the court has ruled that, it is possible to do so, what does that open us up to?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think, my view is that the government did lie when they were collecting this information. I think if one of the big techs, Google or Facebook, had have lied in the same way, I think they'd probably be getting a fine for the way they'd lied in collecting the data. People are very sensitive these days about collection of personal and private data. And there's a whole range of legal processes happening all around the world to try and collect and protect data collected in that way. And I think that the ramifications for the government, they might still be investigated. They are still meant to comply with privacy laws, and it might well be that a regulator down the track wants to look at what they've done and whether they complied. But, it shows that it's much easier for a government to breach your information than it is for corporate entities these days. And I'm not sure what that means for any of us, but you would hope that the government would take that very seriously and put the privacy and data security of Victorians first.
Well, they need to anyway. JP, thank you for your time this evening.
Thanks for having me.